Even as thousands of delegates gathered in St. Petersburg for the Russia's flagship economic forum, Ukraine delivered a striking reminder that the war remains far from Russia's borders. That's right. Ukrainian drones targeted key infrastructure in St. Petersburg, hitting the Petersburg Oil Terminal and naval-linked facilities. The attack came at a particularly sensitive moment, just as Russia was preparing to showcase its economic resilience to the entire world. According to the St. Petersburg governor, Alexander, several infrastructure facilities were damaged and a number of people were injured as well. No casualties have been reported in the strike. The timing of the strike has drawn significant attention. St. Petersburg is hosting the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, or SPIEF, often described as Russia's Davos. The three-day event is expected to attract nearly 20,000 delegates from around 130 countries, including government leaders, business executives, and foreign investors. For the Kremlin, the forum serves as a platform to project confidence and demonstrate that Russia remains economically stable despite Western sanctions and international isolation efforts. But Ukraine's drone attack has cast a shadow over that narrative. The city itself holds immense strategic and symbolic importance for Russia. Founded by Tsar Peter in 1703, St. Petersburg was the capital of the Russian Empire for more than 2 centuries and remains one of Russia's most important political and cultural center. Located on the Baltic Sea, the city is a critical gateway for Russian trade and home to major industries including shipbuilding, energy, logistics, and technology. Now, this is not the first time St. Petersburg has come under attack since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. In April 2023, a bomb blast at a city cafe killed pro-war military blogger and injured dozens. In January 2024, Ukraine carried out its first confirmed long-range drone strike on the Petersburg Oil Terminal, demonstrating its ability to hit targets more than 1,200 kilometers inside the Russian territory. And later that year, another drone struck a residential building, forcing the evacuation of residents. The growing frequency of such attacks has highlighted Ukraine's expanding long-range strike capabilities. Military analysts say that the latest operation is significant not only because of the physical damage caused, but also because of the psychological and the political impact. By striking St. Petersburg during Russia's premier economic event, Kyiv has sent a message that even Russia's most prominent cities and showcases events are not beyond the reach of the conflict. As the war enters another year, the attack underscores how Ukraine is increasingly targeting strategic assets deep inside Russia's territory, challenging Moscow's efforts to project normalcy and stability amid an ongoing war. But if Ukraine can repeatedly strike deep inside Russia, even during one of Kremlin's most important global events, does it expose a growing vulnerability in Russia's air defenses and its ability to shield strategic assets far from the battlefield? I'm being joined by Professor Swaran Singh, who is a professor at JNU. Professor, I just want to ask you, do you think that this attack undermines and exposes a major gap in Russia's security and their air defense systems?
Clearly, you have mentioned in great detail how St. Petersburg is not the usual, but has occasionally been target of strikes, particularly drone strikes and of course some bomb strikes. But this timing, I think, is very critical, and it's not just exposing the vulnerabilities of Russia's air defense. I think it's a personal insult in that sense to President Putin, who's tomorrow going to address this St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which is now running in its 29th edition, is an annual event that is often called Russia's Davos Forum kind of an event. It gets delegates, as you mentioned, usually 20,000 and above, including foreign delegates from 130 countries. And this was part of Russia showcasing whether Western sanctions has made Russia vulnerable or it still has several developmental partners in that sense. So St. Petersburg being the target at this moment, when from 3rd of May to 6th of May, 3rd of June to 6th of June, we are having this international event being hosted in St. Petersburg, is both showcasing the vulnerability of Russian defenses, but also because President Putin was to tomorrow address the plenary session of this forum. And this strike coming on the eve of that event, I think is very intended. Already given the fact that St. Petersburg has often been the target, we saw this year, last month on 9th of May, the Victory Day parade already being impacted, disrupted, shrunk. It was actually held only within the palace. So it is clearly intended in terms of its timing, and it also showcases, as you mentioned, this city is roughly between 11 and 1200 kilometers, depending on from where Ukraine wants to strike it. And these deep strikes are showcasing Ukraine's capability to still do this kind of infrastructural damage.
Right.
And this city also is very significant, particularly we are discussing energy crisis around the world these days.
Right.
St. Petersburg happens to be the largest transshipment hub in northwestern Russia in that sense, and a window to trade with European countries. So, in several ways, it becomes a significant both in terms of how President Putin's personal reputation is being impacted, and of course, also the whole military reputation of Russia is being impacted, and how the event itself will take place, because Saudi Arabia, celebrating 100 years of diplomatic relations with Russia, is the guest
Right.
of this International Economic Forum. And remember, they are on opposite sides, Russia and Saudi Arabia, when it comes to Iran crisis. So that is also a fairly fragile equation, which was being sought to be reinforced as a great partnership, and even that could get impacted with this way of very unusual attack by drone on St. Petersburg at this time.
Well, that's right, Professor. But the attack in the St. Petersburg's facility is not just about the infrastructure damage, and it's not just about the energy crisis that is unfolding in the entire world. Of course, Russia has to pay the price for that. But I think the real damage is at the reputation and at the whole narrative of the Moscow that we are still resilient and we do not care about the Western sanctions, because it's a global embarrassment in front of 130 delegates, 20,000 delegates from 130 countries. Your one of the most important city is being targeted by Ukrainian drones. What kind of message is now Moscow sending across? Because the war is in its 5th year now, and we don't see any end in sight. And at this moment, at a very critical time, when you have your most important city being under attack from drones from your rival country, what is the messaging that is going forward about Putin's leadership at this moment?
Absolutely. This is not an attack which should be measured in terms of the damage it is doing, because we know that the frequency of attacks on St. Petersburg has been
Right.
really sparse and not very impactful. But the timing and symbolisms, as you're underlining, is what is significant here. And because this St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is, is a flagship event of Russia to showcase how they have been able to sustain global partnerships despite continued Western sanctions, and of course, in face of Ukraine war. Uh, and that timing and symbolism, therefore, is very significant. I do understand that this is going to obtain enormous publicity that a usual attack on St. Petersburg would not have otherwise solicited. But because of the timing and this great event happening in St. Petersburg, which you also mentioned, was actually the capital city for about 200 years
Right.
plus. And even today, it's a major cultural hub. Indeed, an American cultural delegation, it's the US Commission on Fine Arts,
Right.
which is already there in St. Petersburg, led by Rodney Cook, who is a very close advisor of President Trump and is overlooking this controversial extension of the eastern wing of White House. So someone who's having a great proximity to President Trump is leading a delegation, is in that city. So in that sense, the timing of this attack and in that sense, symbolisms are much more significant. And I think that is what I think President Vladimir Putin, as he addresses the plenary session tomorrow, we will have to notice as to what he has to say as to why St. Petersburg and events like this can still become vulnerable to such strikes by Ukraine, and why it is that the Russian air defense was not able to intercept and destroy them in air, knowing fully well that this is symbolic great event taking place in that city, and sufficient care must have been taken in terms of ensuring that no such air strikes can happen on that city during that period. But we saw that even during this period, if strikes can go through, then that I think really is in that sense helping the morale of Ukrainians, which have been suffering strikes after strikes. But also in Ukraine war, there has been no major breakthroughs no, for either side for a long period of time. Such symbolisms therefore also become important for Ukraine to showcase that it's not that the standstill is continuing and both sides are kind of in a stalemate situation, that Ukraine can still hit something as symbolic as St. Petersburg on eve of Russia's Davos event. So I think symbolisms and timings are very, very significant in hitting
Right.
the prestige of Russia and I dare say prestige of President Vladimir Putin himself,
Right.
who is in that city and going to speak to the forum tomorrow morning. So symbolisms are significant, I think, in that sense. And I think we would expect some response from President Putin in his speech tomorrow morning.
That's right, Professor. I also, it's a long shot to draw parallels between Iran and the U.S. war and between Russia and the Ukraine war. But there have been a lot of narratives that is going around that Donald Trump must have not correctly assessed his enemy. Do you think that's the situation with Putin as well? Do you think that he was not actually anticipating the war to drag on for 5 years now, even with the support of NATO and the European countries? Ukraine is the one who has actually shown the symbol of resilience at this moment and striking the country, enemy country, at a time when it's hosting important delegation, important people, and an important economic forum. Do you think that there's a moment where Putin must have not correctly assessed his enemy?
Allow me to say, as an academic, if you look into the history of warfare, very rarely wars can end as they are planned.
Right.
Invariably, wars are started by nations when they think that they can have a quick victory at hand, and invariably it prolongs. And you can see wars one after another, including two world wars, or now, as you're mentioning, war in Ukraine or war in Iran. The nations that initiate war have a very clear understanding of finishing it very quickly. But as the events unfold, and we are seeing how events have unfolded with entire Western countries, and President Biden used to talk about 50 nations coalition standing behind Ukraine to fight against Russia. And likewise, the resilience and the persistence that Iran has showcased in case of war against United States, we notice that there is a certain amount of not just stalemate in both these wars, but also fatigue on both sides. And therefore, even when the kind of ceasefires are fragile, peace agreements are not coming, but still both sides are not giving up their determination to continue fighting. And in that sense, occasionally we see strikes like the one that happened yesterday in St. Petersburg, repeatedly symbolizing that we are still active in war, whereas much of the capabilities are really much more kind of fatigued over a period of time. And we notice that both Russia and United States are looking for possibilities of end of these wars and exit from these wars as soon as possible. But the prestige very often keeps them pushed into continuing those wars and continue to make these grand claims of victory sometimes, or ceasefire or peace agreement, which continue to defy any fruition. And we notice that just like in history of warfare, most wars have started with an imagination of finishing that war very quickly, but invariably had dragged on for a rather longer period of time, ending very often in stalemates without any clear, decisive victory or defeat. So, in that sense, few quick operations become an exception, where a nation can choose to hit on a certain limited number of strikes and close that kind of operation soon after that. But otherwise, usually wars end up in fatigue, stalemate, and continued kind of grand posturing
Right.
without any change on the ground. And that is what we are noticing both in Ukraine and Iran. There is no fundamental change happening on the ground, but verbose claims and counterclaims continue. And sometimes, as you saw yesterday in St. Petersburg, symbolic strikes to either bring up the morale of their armed forces, which are feeling really exhausted, or use such an event as St. Petersburg International Economic Forum to showcase that Ukraine can still reach as far as St. Petersburg, which is a significant hub in various ways for culture, for shipbuilding, for trade, for logistics, for technology, for energy.
Right.
So, in that sense, exposing Russia's limitations at such an event is what I think must have been the intention, and it had served Ukraine very well. But as I said, I hope President Putin will have something to say about it tomorrow morning.